Let's get right into it. Number 9, the infinite information loop. Most people assume that staying up until 2 in the morning scrolling through terrible news just means they're trying to stay informed. You think you're being a responsible citizen, keeping a vigilant eye on a chaotic world? But clinical psychologists don't view doom scrolling as education. They view it as a maladaptive coping mechanism. When your baseline anxiety spikes, your brain hates feeling panicked for no obvious reason. It wants a concrete threat to focus on so it can feel like it is in control. So, it traps you in a cycle of threat detection. You scroll, you find a horrific headline, and your brain temporarily validates the fear. It is a safety-seeking compulsion. It is exactly like pressing a bruised muscle over and over just to make sure it still hurts. Reading the news is completely normal, but this behavior crosses the line into a recognized symptom of generalized anxiety disorder when you aren't actually scrolling to gain knowledge. Instead, you are driven by an uncontrollable urge to neutralize a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread. You aren't learning anything new. You are just sitting in the dark, helping your amygdala find a reason to panic. Number 8, the clean eating trap society practically worships the person who perfectly meal preps, cuts out all processed ingredients, and strictly follows a clean eating lifestyle. We look at that level of intense dietary discipline and see the ultimate picture of health. But when the quest for wellness becomes a rigid obsession, it stops being discipline. Clinical psychologists recognize this as a severe eating disorder known as orthorexia nervosa. Unlike anorexia, which focuses heavily on restricting the quantity of food to lose weight, orthorexia is an overwhelming psychological obsession with the purity of the food itself. The anxiety surrounding anything deemed impure or toxic becomes so intense that the person's list of safe ingredients shrinks down to almost nothing. Eating a salad is perfectly healthy, but this crosses the line into a clinical pathology, often categorized under other specified eating disorders, when breaking the diet causes extreme panic and total social isolation. The body's actual nutritional needs are completely ignored in favor of a mental rulebook. It is exactly like a mechanic refusing to put gas in a car because the fuel isn't 100% molecularly flawless. You feel completely in control right up until the engine just dies. You aren't ascending to peak wellness. You are starving your brain of basic nutrients in the pursuit of immortality. Number 7, the extreme apology reflex. You know that person who apologizes to an inanimate object when they bump into it? Or who always types "sorry to bother you" before asking a perfectly normal question? Society usually writes them off as chronic people pleasers or assumes they are just deeply insecure. But neurologists have a completely different explanation. It is called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, and it is a heavily researched clinical feature of ADHD. For the ADHD brain, the emotional regulation center struggles to hit the brakes. When they perceive even a minor critique or slight, whether it is real or entirely imagined, the nervous system gets flooded with intense distress. It is exactly like having a severe sunburn on your emotions. What feels like a light social tap to a neurotypical person hits them like a literal baseball bat. Apologizing when you actually make a mistake is normal, but this crosses into a pathological symptom when the reflex triggers in a zero-threat environment, dictating their choices and preventing them from setting boundaries. The constant apologizing isn't politeness. It is a preemptive defense mechanism to ensure everyone around them is perfectly calm. They aren't just being nice, their brain is actively trying to survive a perceived social execution. Number 6, the just right micro-compulsion. We hear the phrase all the time. People love to claim they are a little OCD just because they color code their bookshelf or prefer a perfectly straightened picture frame. But liking things neat is just a personality trait. True obsessive-compulsive disorder is a neurological nightmare, and one of its most invisible forms has nothing to do with cleanliness. Clinical psychologists call it just right OCD. Rather than being driven by a logical fear, like thinking your house will burn down if you don't check a lock, this subtype is triggered by a persistent, agonizing feeling of incompleteness. The brain's internal task complete signal completely misfires. A person might have to tap their pen, reread a sentence, or set down a water glass dozens of times, waiting for a sudden, unexplainable neurological click so the action finally feels correct. Fixing a crooked painting once is completely normal human behavior, but this crosses into mental illness when these physical micro-compulsions consume hours of the day, trapping the person inside basic, everyday tasks. It is exactly like hitting send on a crucial email, but the loading bar gets stuck at 99%, and you just have to sit there staring at it forever. They aren't being quirky perfectionists. They are prisoners to a neurological glitch that simply won't let them move on. Number 5, the invisible grooming trap. At some point, almost everyone has popped a minor pimple or picked at a loose thread of skin on their lip. It is a completely standard human grooming instinct, but for roughly 2 to 5% of the population, that natural instinct breaks down and crosses into a recognized mental illness. Excoriation disorder. Instead of a casual habit you can just stop with willpower, it becomes a body-focused, repetitive behavior. Triggered by stress, boredom, or spotting a perceived flaw, the person enters an almost hypnotic trance. They cannot stop picking, scratching, or tearing at their own skin. The brain miswires self-grooming with stress relief, releasing a tiny hit of dopamine every time a blemish is picked. This reinforces a destructive loop where the psychological urge to smooth out the skin completely overrides the physical pain of creating a wound. Mild picking is normal, but this crosses the clinical line in the DSM-5 when it results in physical lesions and severe emotional distress. It is exactly like a self-driving car programmed to wash the windshield, but it never stops wiping until the glass shatters. What starts as a simple check in the mirror ends as a neurobiological glitch, locked deep inside the brain's motor cortex. Number 4. The invisible time warp. There is a brutal, unspoken rule in our culture. If you are chronically late, you are selfish, disorganized, and you simply do not value other people's time. But for millions of people with ADHD, chronic lateness is not a moral failing. It is a literal sensory deficit that clinical experts call time blindness. Neurotypical brains possess an internal clock that continuously tracks how much time has passed. ADHD brains do not. Because the prefrontal cortex is understimulated due to dopamine dysregulation, the brain cannot physically map the passage of hours. To them, there are only 2 time zones, now and not now. 5 minutes and 50 minutes feel exactly the same. It is exactly like trying to drive the exact speed limit in a car that has no speedometer. You are forced to just guess, and you are usually wrong. Being late because of sudden traffic is a normal human experience, but this crosses the line into a clinical symptom when someone consistently loses jobs or ruins relationships because they genuinely cannot predict that a quick shower will take 15 minutes instead of 2. They aren't trying to insult you, they are just stranded in a neurological present tense. Number 3. The extreme independence trap. Hustle culture loves to glorify the hyper-independent person. We praise the lone wolf who never asks for help and handles everything alone, treating them like the ultimate successful adult. But in clinical psychology, extreme self-reliance is rarely a sign of strength. It is often a severe trauma response or a hallmark of avoidant personality disorder. To this nervous system, trust is viewed as a lethal threat. Because of past trauma or neglect, the brain has learned that relying on others is fundamentally unsafe and will only result in pain. They don't refuse help because they are simply highly capable. They refuse it because the psychological terror of being vulnerable is completely overwhelming. It is exactly like refusing to wear a seatbelt because you think you can just brace yourself in a crash. You feel entirely in control, but you are actually completely unprotected. Being self-sufficient is a healthy human trait. But this behavior crosses into a disorder when the refusal to accept support permanently isolates a person, leading to severe burnout and loneliness. They aren't building a solitary empire. They are just building a fortress to keep from getting hurt again. Number 2. The maladaptive dream state. Picture yourself staring out a window, imagining a better life or finally winning a fictional argument. It is a completely normal function of a creative brain. But for a hidden subset of the population, an active imagination isn't a harmless distraction. It is a severe behavioral addiction heavily researched in clinical psychology, known as maladaptive daydreaming. First identified by Dr. Eli Sommer, this condition crosses the threshold from innocent fantasy into a dissociative cage. Triggered by something as simple as pacing or listening to music, The brain creates hyper-detailed cinematic universes. The person forms intense emotional attachments to characters who do not exist. Because this internal world offers a massive neurological payoff, often masking trauma or severe loneliness, it becomes far more rewarding than reality. Someone might pace their room for 6 hours straight, whispering dialogue to shadows while their actual relationships completely fall apart. It is exactly like putting on a hyper-realistic VR headset, except the headset is permanently glued to your face, and you slowly start to forget your real name. They aren't just being highly creative, they are being held hostage by their own imagination. Number 1. The lazy paralysis myth. You know you need to do the dishes. You actually want to do them. But instead, you sit on the couch staring at the sink for 3 hours, quietly hating yourself. Society has a very simple label for this: being lazy. But clinical psychologists have a completely different name for it. It is called executive dysfunction, and it is a primary symptom of conditions like ADHD and severe depression. True laziness is a choice. You don't want to do a task, so you simply avoid it, and you feel perfectly fine about that decision. Executive dysfunction is a prison. You desperately want to move, but your brain flat out refuses to send the required chemical signal. To initiate a task, your frontal lobe needs dopamine to bridge the gap between intention and action. When that neurotransmitter is deficient, you experience literal task paralysis. It is exactly like turning the key in a car with a perfectly good engine, but the starter motor is completely missing. You can turn the key all day long, but the car simply won't move. You aren't lacking willpower, you are just lacking neurotransmitters.